What we're going to be doing in this video is going over some tips and tricks so you can improve your product visualization or product renders. So let's go ahead and get started. So this video is going to primarily focus on lighting as kind of the main thing you can improve when it comes to product viz renders and animations, but there's still some things we want to consider for geometry. And so the more rounded edges, curved surfaces, we have, the more realistic our geometry is going to look. And that's really just a good rule of thumb in general, since it's those curved surfaces, rounded edges that catch reflections, catch highlights. Now, for this particular example, I am just using a dome light to kind of illustrate this as opposed to a 3-point light setup. And I'll touch on, why 3-point light isn't the end all be all. But just to kind of give you an idea here, watch what happens when I just enable fillet on a cube. Look how much more dynamic and interesting this looks. Look at the different reflections we're now getting because of that fillet, because of those rounded edges, those curved surfaces we now have. And so to take this even further, you could use, say, a twist deformer and see just how much more interesting an image you get, how much more detail in your reflections you get when you do something like that. Even if I just turn off the fillet here and we're working with the twist, we get something like this compared to the standard default cube. So whether it's using deformers like twist, like bend, to curved surfaces, whether it's using a fillet, if your object is still primitive, there are other ways to curve surfaces if your object is not a primitive. Say it's an editable object. One of the ways I would recommend is the bevel deformer, and I've done a video about this in the past, but you can make it a child of your object. It's going to bevel the edges, and in a lot of ways it's similar to the cap section of an extrude object. You can see we can round this out and get pretty much the same detail we had before with our fillet. And what's nice about the bevel deformer is it can actually work with different selections of edges. So if you do have a complex object, you don't have to bevel every edge. It can also bevel based on an angle threshold. So that can help make sure you don't have to bevel unnecessary edges as well. If that is not an option, the last tip I have for rounding out geometry would be to do it in a material. So I have a lot of materials in the scene for some of the other things I have going on, and we already have our crow material, so I don't know why I created a new one, but we have the rounded edges node we can use. So if you just search for, round corners, not rounded edges, though pretty much the same thing, and we connect this round corners to, say, the bump map. This is another alternative we have for rounding edges. Now this one is probably the one that I would say, to be the most cautious of using, because it's only faking rounding these edges. So it's just doing a little shading trick here to give us the illusion of rounded edges. So it's not actually doing it like the bevel, like the fillet in a primitive. So while this can work, it's certainly better suited for objects that are far away from the camera and that we're not going to get close up and where a lot of detail is required. Because if I get out of the camera and zoom in a bit, right, you'll kind of see how it doesn't really work all that well depending on the angle we're seeing it. In fact, you can still kind of see the hard point there, even though we have some of that roundness, kind of going on. But as soon as we zoom back a little bit, it really starts to, kind of work. Okay. So those are the 3 different ways you can round out your geometry to give it more detail and help improve your reflections. Now, when it comes to lighting for product viz, I think a 3-point light setup is a very popular place to start, especially for beginners. But I would caution you against that, as the results you get might not be very good. And there's plenty of other videos online about how to set up 3-point lighting, so I won't get too much into it. But ultimately, if you have a simple scene like I have here, can't get much simpler than a cube with a couple of lights, the results may not be very good. And that's because there just isn't a lot for our objects to reflect. That's what we're seeing here, just the emptiness of our scene, and that is what we're seeing in our reflection. On the other hand, we have the reflections of the lights themselves, which may not look very good, maybe overwhelming. And so 3-point lighting can be tricky to do. Now I could keep adding lights, moving them around a bit more, and that could give me enough in terms of my reflections and overall illumination. But I want to stress that you can do a lot with just a dome light. And oftentimes the HDRIs you use, like Studio 21 here, is meant to replicate a studio lighting setup, okay, and can give you very good results. So that's what I've done here. I've even gone so far as to rotate this to try and get some more interesting reflections. You'll notice kind of the default rotation is not that interesting, but as we move it around, we can get something that does look a bit better. Now, you can certainly add in other lights as necessary. So whether that's the key light, which in this case isn't doing a whole lot, or the rim light, which is probably doing too much, or perhaps the fill light, which is doing a bit more. Now, look, I could certainly move these a bit more around. I wouldn't mind a little bit more of a highlight from the fill light, less from the rim light here, obviously, and the key, I think, as well, could be made to work here. But as you start adding more and more lights, whether it's a dome light and some additional area lights, which is the light type I would recommend, be careful about the ratios of intensity between all your lights, because you do want there to be some lights that are brighter than the others. You don't want to just wash everything out. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is, let's say you are using 3-point lighting to light something like this car. And just so you know, this car is from an old pack of models I bought that didn't originally had octane materials on it. So it's not something I can share since it was something I purchased. I'm not even sure where I purchased this. It was so long ago. But these cars actually have a lot of detail and they hold up pretty well, even though I mostly use them for architectural visualization where, you were quite a bit further away. But you'll see that I have some really big reflections here from these area lights, these giant rectangles that I'm seeing, on the roof, on the hood here, even on this side. Okay. And what I would recommend doing with those is breaking them up or softening or doing something to them so they're not just a flat white shape, whether it's a rectangle because that's the area light shape you're using. Maybe it's going to be circular because you're using disc, sphere, maybe even cylinder. Okay. So you can either do it using a texture if you click add graph and work with the node system in Cinema 4D, or if you have an image, you could load it in here. Okay, so if I click add graph, it's going to create this material appropriately named extra material, since that's what's on the name of my light here. I can now open this material, and don't be surprised when you see this, because this editor is the old Redshift shader graph, which is what we used to create materials in before the Cinema 4D node editor. But now what I can do, and it works pretty much the same as the node editor we have now, you can search for a texture in here. So if you wanted to add an image, for instance, or you wanted to add a ramp, or you wanted to add a noise, all things we can do. So I'm going to create a ramp. And to help me visualize this, I'm going to select this extra light and come down here and check visible so we can see what that light looks like. And all I'm going to do is connect our ramp to the general color. All right. And we can see that it disappeared. Not actually what I was expecting, but let's switch the mapping here to circular. See if we get something a little bit different. Why don't we try stopping that render? I may need to refresh it, but with it visible there, it should be showing up. Hence the visible part. There we go. So, this is what it was looking like initially. If we switch it to circular, we can see it is circular, but I kind of want the darker values around the outside. And that's where if I was using like a bounce card or something like that, maybe I would plug this into the opacity. I actually haven't tried that on a light. I typically work with, the color here or just using the texture section. But now we can adjust this to really help soften the edges of those reflections to help break them up. And that can really add a lot more polish to our renders here. So that's looking pretty good. I can uncheck visible now because I don't really want to see that light. Why don't we do that to the rim light back here as well? Now there is a texture slot. Like I said, you can load in an image. I don't like to, mention plugins just because try to keep things simple. But the Redshift Plus library does have quite a few different gobos, which is the technical kind of term for, what we're doing. We're changing the shape of the light. And so, there's some really interesting ones in here, especially if you wanted to do something where you already had like a room and you wanted to add some detail with the shadow. So it's like there's a window with a tree outside, something like that. You could very easily make your own as well. And I do think that's kind of one of the uses of something like an HDRI Light Studio, is because there's all these different ways we can affect our lights, whether it's using scrim lights or different polygons, gradients like we saw, and you can maybe get an idea of some different shapes we could make, different bulbs in our light, you name it, all different ways of breaking up the light to add the reflections exactly, where we want them to, using the process we saw previously. Though I will say a program like HDRI Light Studio, can really simplify that. It's something I've used in the past. So if you guys do want to see a video about it, let me know. But yeah, I think if nothing else, this is kind of a great way to look at the different shapes we could very easily make ourselves. There they go, kind of showing the same thing we're trying to do to help break up those reflections, soften them up, perhaps even add a little bit more detail. So, that's all we're really trying to do here. Whether you want to do that with a ramp, you want to make something in Photoshop, you find something online, or even a plugin like Grayscale Gorilla, there are plenty of other options here. So once again, with the material that just got added to our rim light here, I'll add a ramp. Why don't we make this light visible? So I'm not 100% sure how visible it'll be. Should be pretty visible. There we go. Right. And general color again. All right, let's refresh this. Maybe that will fix it. There we go. And then, yeah, just like we did before, we don't have to do circular. In fact, maybe I want the darker part up top, since that is where, the top of that reflection is. And so that can soften just that part of our reflection there. And so once again, just kind of with it, without, notice how much that edge softens. And, just makes the light and the reflection a little bit less distracting. Also distracting is how visible that light is. So let's go ahead, uncheck that. And yeah, those are a few ways we can work with our area lights to make them look a little bit better. And then lastly, if anyone's curious how I have kind of the background environment set up, I have a background set in my camera. All right, just kind of a ramp image. I'm a bit surprised we can't do something similar to what we did with the light, where we can add a material and have that piped in through here. Perhaps that's something Redshift will add at some point. And then I have a backdrop, okay, which, if I stop the renderer, we can see. Let's hide the lighting from our perspective view to simplify things. But what's really bringing this together here is the Redshift object tag. And I've made a video about this in the past, but in the matte section here is really kind of where we're getting this to work. We're essentially just applying the shadows on our background, and it works pretty well. I think that rim light, I would need to change the size of it so we don't get quite as harsh shadows in the back there. But aside from that, this works very well and does give us kind of a seamless look in our render without having to, go to a compositing program. Now, another thing that's quite common when it comes to working with product renders, especially if you're working with a 3-point light setup, would be to add some color to our lights. And if we were doing this in a more traditional route, we'd be adding some gels over the light. So, for instance, we could take our key light here and maybe make it a little warmer. Maybe that's a bit too warm, something like that. And then in the fill light, can make this a little bit cool. And while I definitely added too much of this to kind of overemphasize what this can do, I think this really does kind of change the way this image looks and perhaps makes your image look that much better. Now, I do want to be a bit careful here because I can see the reflections a bit on my light. So I may want to go back and, add some gobos, a texture, perhaps even just a ramp to soften that up a little bit as well. But I quickly wanted to touch on how much of an impact adding some color to our lights can enhance the way our image looks. Now, to kind of end this, what I wanted to do is go through and light, a simple product shot, give you an idea of how I would approach it so that you can do this in your own projects. I'm going to start by creating a dome light here, placing it inside of my null to stay organized. And honestly, with, how we're going to be using this dome light, we probably don't need to load in an image. I think a simple color would work just fine, but I'll load in that Studio 21, okay? Only because I know it's in the asset browser. Honestly, all these assets came from the asset browser. So if this is something you wanted to kind of remake, you absolutely could. Now, I think I did have to convert some of these materials to Redshift materials. I think it was, can't remember if it was for the fruit or the pineapple juice here. But yeah, so that way you could kind of end up doing something similar. Once again, I'm going to rotate this to see if I can get something I like a little bit better. I'm not as concerned about the reflections here. The pineapple's pretty diffuse. There aren't too many strong reflections. The strong reflection up top there may be a bit much. And as I'm, working with this, if I'm happy with the way this looks great, maybe I don't have to add too many other lights. I could always work with the exposure value. I mean, maybe not that high, or intensity to help brighten this up. And this doesn't look terrible, but really what it's lacking is kind of, some brightness from a key light or one main light source. And so what I'll do is create an area light, right? And I think it's going to be easier to just get out of my camera for this. And it places it kind of right at the origin, which is where I built this. But I'm going to want this a little bit further back, maybe at an angle. But before I do too much more, let's hide that dome light too, so it's not visible here. I'm going to turn this into a target light. So I'll just click on the little drop down here in my light object properties and choose add target tag and null. So now it's going to look at this null it created. And so now if I move this light, it's always going to face our object. So maybe we want it up here a little bit, something like that. At this point, kind of come in and see what this looks like. It's obviously way too bright, okay? But as I make adjustments, I'm going to start with my dome light off. I want this to look, good by itself. Then we'll add the dome light in. This looks okay. I might want it just a little bit more illuminating the product itself. So perhaps we do something like that. Okay, we have our dome light in there. See, that's kind of flattening things out a bit too much. So in our dome light, I'm going to start turning this down. Right, and I don't know if I want it to that low, but something like this isn't terrible. It's adding a little bit of illumination, kind of on the back side there, on the bottom. Still maybe a bit too much. So we'll go with something like that. God, that's still really bright there. So maybe we go a little bit lower on our light. And this is something too where, maybe I go into this material and make some changes there. Another really important thing with adding these other lights, and I think product shots in general, is separating the object from the background, right? So we have our pineapples, we have our pineapple juice here, we have our green background. It's all kind of blending together. And so we want to separate that. And so, maybe the area light does that, maybe the dome light does, but adding a rim light is going to be something that makes a big difference here. So I'm just going to duplicate that light I've already created, and I can move it in the back. And I'm checking my other views here to make sure it's kind of flat. And once again, going to turn off my other light so I can see just what that light's doing. And, on its own, it looks okay. But since everything else is so dark, it's hard to see how it all kind of ties together. But that brightness that we're seeing here is really what's going to help it pop help these objects pop and separate from the background. So I can add the main light in. All right, now we're still getting some things that are a bit too bright. So, I would want to see where a lot of that brightness is coming from. Okay, and it's still coming from the main light. So maybe we turn this even lower. All right, that is looking better. We can see what our dome light looks like now, adding that in. I think it's looking pretty good. Maybe want this just a little bit lower. All right, but yeah, that pop of brightness in the back is really helping to separate our pineapples and even the product here from the background. Now, I do think it's maybe a bit too much on the sides here, maybe the top two, as we can see. All right, it's adding a lot of reflection there. So some things I could try would be, once again, maybe just working with the angle here a little bit. All right, I probably want it with something like that, so we get less of a reflection on the carton. We're still getting it on the top of the carton, so maybe we move it down a little bit, maybe changing the size, perhaps adding that like ramp or other shape in there. But now we have something that, like I said, really just helping the back pop. Okay, and is it a bit too much? It might be, but I really like the overall effect it's adding, even if I'm still not thrilled 100% with the reflections it's adding. And I'll finish up by saying, don't be afraid to go into the detail section here, because we could turn down how much reflection this light is adding. All right, or maybe we would want to turn down the diffuse, so it's just adding a reflection. Okay, maybe we would want to come into the rim light here, into the project section, and exclude the carton altogether. Now that can get very complex, because I probably would need some light or another light to light just the back of this, but at least I would have control over that. And that's where, some of the complexity comes in from doing a product shot. But as I'm trying to keep this simple, we won't get too much into that. But I think with that will do it for this one. If there's anything else you would like to see, please leave me a comment down below. And if you found this video helpful, I'd appreciate it if you could like it and subscribe to my channel. Until next time, take care.